Good morning, everyone, and I'm very glad to be back home in Montclair and working with you on this historic day to understand the meaning of Juneteenth. Like many celebrations, Juneteenth identifies a specific day, a specific event, a specific place that recognizes a singular moment in the African-American fight for emancipation and freedom. So although we'll discuss this particular history, I want us to also place that history within the larger context of the 19th century, but also connect it to 2020. And while we're in this place, everybody's asked about Juneteenth in cities and states now or as a holiday, and as you know, corporations are now making it a day for their employees. But I want us to think in terms of what Juneteenth means.
Hi, we're having trouble hearing you. Your voice is crackling.
Really?
Yeah,
you can't hear me?
The connection is not secure. It's spotty.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just make sure everybody else in my house is off, and I will pause and just be right back. Sorry about that.
It's actually much better right now.
Yeah, it is better now, Lily.
Better now. I don't know why, but it was crackling before and it was cutting in and out, but now it sounds better. So I don't know if there was something happening on your screen before that's not happening now.
No, it looks the same. Let me just make sure. I think if everyone else is off, there will be less of a drain. Okay. If at any point you can't hear me, if you would just kind of raise your hand or let me know. Thank you so much, Sandra. The part that you may have missed was me simply saying I want to make sure we understand the larger context of Juneteenth, both in terms of the 19th century, but also its meaning for us today and why we are focusing on this celebration. The place where I would like to start, obviously, is Juneteenth itself. At this point, many of you may have been reading in the newspapers and hearing on the news why this particular date. It's the date in which Major General Gordon Granger, who was placed in command of the District of Texas, read to the people of Texas General Order Number 3 on June 19th, 1865 in Galveston. And fundamentally what this order was, if you think through, obviously this is at the end of the Civil War, it actually has ended already. And what is happening is General Granger is giving an order that replicates what is actually in the Emancipation Proclamation, which we will talk about later. Juneteenth is nothing more than the shortened form of June 19th. And at least as of today, 47 states and the District of Columbia commemorate this day. I thought you would be interested in seeing how Emancipation Day or Juneteenth has been celebrated, especially in Texas, where it has its origins, since the order itself was for Texas. These are some photographs from Austin, Texas, showing what we could imagine to be very much like a 4th of July celebration. Having music and bands, as you see in this slide, people dressed up to the nines in hat and gloves, suits and attire, to celebrate this event. Here you have a Civil War reenactment in 1900 on June 19th in Eastwoods Park in Austin. Picnic tables and a tent set up for food and celebration. So you can see from these photographs how seriously people in Austin, Black people in Austin, are taking this holiday as a time to both commemorate the Civil War and their freedom, but also as a moment of celebration. In this particular slide, you see an organization of officers and directors who are posing because they are pushing for an official Emancipation Day celebration. And they actually want to form a formal organization. I want you to note the 1909 at the bottom of the screen on the picture, because that is the same date as the founding of the National NAACP. So this is the period in the early 20th century of a great deal of organizing. And in this instance, organizing, as we still are today, around the celebration of Juneteenth. I will show you in a few minutes the enormity of this, the importance of celebrating freedom. Here you have a photograph from Emancipation Day, Juneteenth, in Richmond, Virginia in 1905. Freedom celebrations have been part of the African American experience even before the Civil War. As you can well understand, there are these seminal moments in the 19th century that mark a moving of the needle toward freedom and away from slavery. Not complete freedom, but a movement of the needle nonetheless. August 1, 1834 is the date of Great Britain abolishing slavery in the Caribbean. And that is celebrated as a pivotal moment when the possibility of freedom becomes concretized, right, for Black people in America. Slavery is abolished in Washington, D.C., April 16, 1862. Very often we don't, because we conceive of a Washington, D.C. as a national site, we do not remember or affirm that it was made up of Virginia and Maryland, that slavery was a part of the national landscape in our nation's capital, that Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of DC, was a major trading, auctioning site for the trading, buying and selling of Black bodies. But slavery was abolished in Washington, DC in 1862. And April 16th is a public holiday in Washington, D.C. So you will notice, for example, I remember seeing that there are years when paying federal taxes falls on April 16th, if the 15th is on a Sunday, but then it's pushed back to the 17th because the 16th is a public holiday in the District of Columbia. 1862 and 1863, we actually have a two-phased Emancipation Proclamation. So one of the things we need to realize is that African Americans in the North and Midwest in particular knew in advance that this Emancipation Proclamation was coming on January 1. And so Black people are assembled in churches like Bethel AME in Philadelphia. They are assembled in churches in Boston and New York, waiting for the telegram that this emancipation is coming. So this becomes a particularly seminal moment for African American freedom. And then April 3rd, 1865 is celebrated in Richmond, Virginia as the day when Union troops take the former Confederate capital of Richmond. And so what I want you to see here is that there's a tradition of celebrating freedom. that there's a tradition of local and regional celebrations, so that even Juneteenth, which really begins as a Texas celebration, begins to spread throughout the United States early on, as Black Texans themselves migrate and move to other areas of the country, particularly in the South and Southwest. They take that celebration with them and it spreads. And so we should not be surprised that in some ways the embracing Juneteenth as a national holiday by African Americans and to be celebrated by the entire nation, that is occurring in 2020. It's a continuation of this evolution of a particular moment in our history. Here you see an April 16, 1862 celebration of the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. Here, the description I gave to you earlier of a depiction, at least, of a watch meeting by the artist William Tolman Carleton in 1863, showing symbolically African Americans waiting for the moment when emancipation would come. And then finally, this Harper's Weekly illustration showing the emancipation itself. Let us move now to looking at how African Americans get to the point of emancipation, both the Emancipation Proclamation and then the Juneteenth order from General Gordon. Emancipation, in some ways, is a gradual process that really begins early on in the 19th century. If we think about gradual abolition in the North, from 1804 all the way to the Civil War, New Jersey being the last state in the North to actually have enslaved people. That gradual abolition occurs. It's not an immediate freeing of all Black people in the North. That gradual abolition occurs because there's a continuation of an apprenticeship of Black people, and also the continual enslavement of Black children until they reach adult age, 20 or 21 in most state laws. So slavery still exists in the North all the way up to the Civil War. In 1850, as many of you may remember from your US history, the Fugitive Slave Act makes it a federal crime to assist runaways, and local law enforcement is required to capture and return runaways. I haven't included it here on the slide, but what we should see here is that the policing of Black bodies is not only the individual act of someone who assumes that they own another human being. Policing is also communal in terms of both patrols, but now we have not only law enforcement, but individual American citizens required to assist in recapturing Black people who have run away and claimed their own freedom. During the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, there are approximately 200,000 of what are called the colored troops. And here, what I want us to understand with emancipation is that African American people also freed themselves as members of the Union Army, but as the members of the US Army, and also by running away as the US Army advances into rebel territory. And then finally, before the war, 1861, at the beginning of the war, 1861 and 1862, Lincoln and Congress issue confiscation acts in order to seize property owned by those participating in the Confederate Rebellion. And I will continue to use that phrase, those participating, because Maryland and Delaware as slave states, for example, do not join the Confederacy, but they are slave states. The seizure of property in 1861, 1862 begins to kind of finesse the movement toward how will the US Army, as a military measure, handle enslaved people who are not only fleeing from plantations, but who essentially are being captured by the US Army itself. Should they be returned? Should they be used as workers by the US Army itself? Should they be protected? So the Confiscation Acts begin to address this issue. One of the things we should always remember about Lincoln, as we try and understand the difference between Lincoln as president and Lincoln as martyr and assassinated president, is that he is thinking about the next election. So Lincoln is well aware of the fact that he has an election in '64, and he does, even though he is at war with these rebel states, he wants to be diplomatic still in how he handles the issue of slavery. The road to emancipation, though, is compromised and delayed for African Americans. December 1863, Lincoln gives a proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction to the rebel states, telling them they have to accept the Confiscation Acts of giving up property, including their enslaved people, and that they must also accept the Emancipation Proclamation. And as all of you know, we then have the 3 Reconstruction Acts that both free African Americans and also seek to guarantee their rights. 13th Amendment will abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment, which is so important in adjudicating cases today for due process and equal protection. It also has a voting rights piece where it is trying to ensure that states do not have representation if they are not in fact recognizing male citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment, the purpose of it is to guarantee Black male suffrage in 1870. At the same time that we see what I call this tiny window of opportunity during Reconstruction, where we look at the Black male suffrage, we look at due process, we look at equal protection under the laws, at the same time that this Reconstruction is going on at the end of the Civil War, violence against Black bodies explodes as a signal to Black people that their freedom, their equality, their rights as citizens will not be recognized and will not be tolerated. It is met with extreme violence. I found this Thomas Nast political cartoon from 1868 entitled Patience on a Monument. And in this cartoon, Thomas Nast captures, I think, wonderfully the inhumanity suffered by African Americans as there's this resistance by white Americans to Black freedom. And it is I hope you can see this well, and you can go and look at the details of it that I've described here to some extent for you. It lists whippings and auctions of enslaved people. It lists several massacres and riots and killings. And I wanted us to note these are occurring in New York as well as in New Orleans and Memphis. He quotes in this illustration from the Dred Scott case that Black people have no rights that any white person ever has to respect. He quotes from several newspapers throughout the country. We must make the Negro understand that we will hold them in abject bondage still. The Richmond Rig writes in an article about a lynching, Negro killed, one vote less. We see the burning of schoolhouses and churches. Something that, especially in the burning of churches, we know is very close to our own experiences. And then at the bottom of this monument, you see the bloodied body of a Black woman and her infant and her child lying at the bottom of an 1868 definition of freedom delayed. And I want us to just take a moment and look at this depiction of what freedom and democracy actually meant, right? It actually meant Black bodies that were bloodied. In another Thomas Nast political cartoon, he depicts the white man's government. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. He depicts the white man's government. He has a 5 Points Irishman, the Ku Klux Klan founder, and a Wall Street financier, all together standing on the back of a Black Civil War veteran. And when I found this, I thought it is all too familiar to us, a picture of white men standing on the back and the head of an African-American man, and in this case, demeaning in particular the audacity of Black men to put on a uniform, to declare their American citizenship with their own blood and bravery. And so we can read into this not only a racial construction, but also a construction about Black maleness, that Black men are not allowed to be men. Another Harper's Weekly illustration of the first vote, and what I hope you can see clearly here, not only these Black men lined up to vote in this 1867 depiction, but also how they are dressed. So you have an elderly, stately Black man in the front, then you have a Black man in a suit and tie, you have a Black soldier, all representing the kind of diversity of African-American men and manhood. And then, of course, this moment of freedom, this opening of this tiny window of voting and political participation affords African-Americans the opportunity to serve at every level of government, both local, state, and here, national. African-Americans serve on school boards, they serve on city councils throughout the South. They also serve in state government and state legislatures. They serve on committees that are tasked with writing a new state constitution. It is African Americans on these new constitutional committees and in state legislatures that open up public schooling in the South, which until they do that in the 19th century, public schooling is in fact, very, it's not available to most citizens. So this becomes a moment of not only Black political freedom, but also political participation and activism. However, just as we saw with, in the early 19th century, Northern states afford limited freedom, gradual freedom to African Americans in the North. And those freedoms in the North come with their own Jim Crow restrictions in the North. a segregated North, a segregated school system in places like Philadelphia in the 19th century, restrictions on jobs, restrictions on housing, very similar to what we will see after the war. That's already established in the North in the 19th century. Then after the Civil War, the question becomes, even with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, how far will the nation go in opening its doors to full Black personhood and citizenship? July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass is delivering the 4th of July address in Rochester, New York. And that talk has come to be entitled by us, by historians, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And in this very famous speech, which you can just search for online and read the entire speech, Douglass questions the degree to which the nation will in fact adhere to its promises to African Americans. In this decade just before the Civil War, he is saying, you have not maintained your promises, the promises of the revolution, the ideals of the revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution. These have not been met. He says this just before the war is beginning. And so, but the reason why I wanted us to think about this speech is we can in some ways see the same question being asked after the Civil War. We can see the same question being asked throughout the 20th century. And in some ways, the importance of today, Juneteenth, means that this question can still be posed for African Americans. What to African Americans is a 4th of July if both the ideals of the revolution and the laws of the Constitution, which itself recognized and affirmed slavery, and even a civil war could not affirm freedom for African Americans, but rather left it limited and compromised. The Reconstruction Acts in 1867-68 actually put into place military control over the former rebel states to try and guarantee Black rights. In other words, we're talking about the US Army presence being in the former Confederate states in order to protect Black life and Black citizenship. The federal government, a radical Congress of radical Republicans, set forth to require Southern states to have brand new constitutions that would in fact in their constitutions recognize these rights. The former Confederate states were required to guarantee universal male suffrage and to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to have legal protections and due process for African Americans. Then we see the first civil rights acts of the nation, which were not the 1960s, but the 1860s, culminate in the end of Reconstruction and the end of all of those protections, laws that had been put in place for this little window of time during Reconstruction. So at the end of Reconstruction, the federal troops leave. With the end of Reconstruction, the violence continues and escalates. With the end of Reconstruction, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 states that segregation, in fact, is legal. At the end of Reconstruction, in fact, violence resurges. There are no protections for African Americans. And in fact, the entire nation, North, South, West, says to African Americans, the war is over, we're back to business as usual for the United States, and the business as usual for the United States is business itself. So the meaning of freedom for African Americans going into the 20th century means that there's discrimination in all walks of life, in housing, where you can live, how much you even pay for your housing versus other people. Of course, jobs and wages, what kinds of jobs you're allowed to hold, how much you're paid versus someone else, and being on the bottom rung of unskilled and even skilled labor, being left out of the labor unions that form at the beginning of the century. Discrimination in education, access to education, and investment in education. Black school teachers are paid less. The investment per pupil is less. Black school children get leftover school books. Discrimination in banking and insurance. Black people cannot get loans. Black people cannot get loans for moving, buying houses in certain neighborhoods. Black people can't get credit. It's also attached to insurance companies that also won't insure Black people buying houses in certain areas. So what I want us to see here is there's this systemic, institutionalized racism that is attached to every aspect of life in America. Popular culture and media representations show Black people as buffoonish. Those who in fact are professional and well-educated are seen as caricatures of a truly refined and civilized person. Black children are shown in depictions as if they're little animals. And we know from the recent news about Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben on all kinds of products throughout America, Black people are depicted as happy servants, meaning happy slaves. Even scholarship and academia rewrite the history of slavery, of enslavement. They rewrite the history of Civil War and Reconstruction to say that slavery was good. Civil War is written as being an unfortunate part of America's history that should never have happened. And Reconstruction is rewritten as an affront to democracy because in that short window, Black people had political participation. As we all know, voting is limited and compromised by poll taxes, by literacy tests. We know that our judicial system, in terms of due process, Black people serving on juries, civil rights, incarceration are also part of this process of limiting Black freedom. And then Black people do not have police protection. And in fact, we'll see how the system of policing is part of the violence against Black bodies. And I especially wanted to show you this depiction of two lynchings so that you would understand we're not talking about the lynching of 4,000 people over the past 150 years as being an individual act only, or the act of outliers, the act of criminals. Rather, lynchings very often were communal events, celebratory. In lynchings, people would take souvenirs from these lynchings. And so we're talking about a societal norm of killing Black men, women, and children. The National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896, was actually the very first civil rights organization. It was not the NAACP. And the thing they took on from the very beginning in 1896 was an anti-lynching campaign that continued on through the 20th century to now, where we know that Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and others are pushing for anti-lynching bill, which in fact was one of the goals of the NAACP as early as 1909 in the 1900s. And to this day, Congress has refused to make lynching a federal crime. And here I want us to, as I move close to the end of this presentation, to allow for questions and comments. We know that in the lifetime of many of those on this call, we are looking at the death of Black people from white vigilantes in our own lifetime. And I think what is surprising to many people, and to many African Americans in particular, what has been the very, very high level of tolerance and acceptance. And to be kind, one might say there isn't an awareness of what I've tried to present to you today, that there is a direct line between the enslavement of Black people and the violence we see today. So that the violence we see today is not a disruption, it is in fact a continuity. So when a teenage child, Emmett Till, is murdered in Money, Mississippi, we should see that as part of the continuation. When a Black church is bombed, and as I said to you before, burnings of Black churches were occurring 100 years ago as part of the retribution against Black people and Black organizing, especially the organizing going on within the Black church as the center of the Black community. We should understand that the violence against Black people does not, in fact, or does in fact include the murder of children. We should also realize that the murder of Black people includes everyone who is an ally of Black people as well, as in the Freedom Summer murders of these 3 volunteers in Mississippi. We know that no one is immune to this vigilante violence. There should be understanding that, in fact, this is not just violence against Black bodies that we see easily from the period of enslavement till now. This is an attack against Blackness. So anyone who affirms, recognizes, fights for the humanity of Black people is viewed as an enemy and can be killed. We all recognize and mourn on this anniversary, very close anniversary, the killings at Emmanuel AME Church, as we try to grapple with the degree to which once a society can affirm and embrace Black people as being less than human, that we are in fact teaching an entire nation and encouraging an entire nation to that Black bodies are expendable, whether it's the police or whether it's a young man who feels that it is his duty, the way someone in 1862 felt it was his duty to fight for the subjugation of Black people and the killing of Black people. What I want us to understand, it is a community event, just like we saw in those pictures of lynchings. There has been sometimes people will make the assumption and will say things like, I'm not racist, or I don't believe that Black people are less than human. But what I want us to see in this history is that the violence against Black people, subjugation of Black people has been societal. It has indeed been institutionalized. It has been systemic. There have been windows of opportunity, but windows of opportunity do not, in fact, dismantle systems. Langston Hughes in 1951 wrote, this is one of his famous poems entitled A Dream Deferred. And I'd like us to think about this poem not only in terms of the 1951 creation of this really wonderful piece of literature, but also in terms of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. What Hughes writes is, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? What we saw in the 1960s civil rights movement and Black Power movement, what we see today in Black Lives Matter, is very consistent also with this trajectory of history of Black people fighting back to affirm their own humanity, fighting back through their culture, fighting back through our institutions, and fighting back in demonstrations. We affirm this sweet land of liberty, and some scholars would say it is African Americans who have worked very hard to bring America up to its ideals and philosophy, that America has fallen short of achieving its own ideals, and in fact will act in ways that are completely contradictory to its own beliefs. And that if anyone is in some ways truly patriotic to those American ideals, it's African Americans who really do believe that these ideals can be achieved and will walk in the streets and demonstrate to bring that to the entire nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lillie. Do we have any questions?
Or comments, questions or comments.
Don't forget you're muted.
Yeah, right. Thank you for the, Marilyn, hi.
Hi, thank you so much. I do have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Which are the 3 states that, now I forgot what it was, that have not accepted, I forget what the
Juneteenth?
Yes, Juneteenth.
Especially since we're being recorded, I don't want to get this wrong. I believe, somehow, I can look it up for you quickly, but I believe it's somehow the Dakotas and maybe Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Wow. I would have guessed southern states, but okay. Oh, thank you so much. I learned so much. It's just so sad that this keeps going on and on.
Hi, it's North Dakota, South Dakota, and Hawaii.
Oh, I did get it right.
Wow.
I question my memory these days, so I thought it was the Dakotas and Hawaii. Yes.
Lillie, when you say they recognize it, they're not public holidays in the.
No, well, it varies by state, so it's kind of all over the place. So some for Texas, I believe it is a public holiday in Texas. In many places, the wording that's used is it is commemorated. Means that kind of there are events and that it is recognized as an important day, but no, it's not a holiday. So I was careful in using that wording. It is commemorated.
Remember correctly, the MLK Day, which is now a federal holiday, started out that way with state. So, I mean, there's hope that it will eventually become a national holiday.
Yes. One of the things happened, I mean, if we compare this to the MLK holiday, the proposal for that holiday came with just this groundswell of backlash and resurrected these kind of kind of J. Edgar Hoover-like accusations of King's Marxism and communism, which is a very interesting contradiction with being a Baptist preacher and also being Marxist. Those ideologies are kind of in two different worlds, right? Framing King as dangerous and un-American. All of those were resurrected all over again in the push for the holiday. And so it wasn't just that he didn't deserve a holiday, but he had to be, there was this effort to just diminish who he was. And this is what we always see, right? The rationale becomes taking away a person's humanity all together. That we don't affirm that Black people are human beings at all. And as one historian has said, once you do that, you can do anything. You can say anything, you can do anything. And so, killing someone who has been framed as a beast, which was a term used, I believe, in a 1900 writing called The Negro a Beast. Once you do that, then you have in fact invited violence, right?
Sort of a justifying discourse, I guess.
Exactly. Well, what becomes really interesting in the especially the early part of the 20th century, when all of this is being framed and hardened, some of it coming from the North, because we have to remember Jim Crow is a character from minstrel shows in New York, right? And so much of the framing we have from dehumanizing Black people in popular culture really is coming from the North, a free North in the early 19th century. In some ways, there is no, what the South is doing during the period of enslavement, and even after, and things like Gone with the Wind, they're trying to say slavery is good, Black people are happy, they can't take care of themselves. If slavery ends, they will disappear from the face of the earth because they're incapable of taking care of themselves. They're like children. We are there, there's this paternalistic rationale that's given. And so what happens, what you see happen with racism, because it's completely irrational, is on one hand, these are children. On the other hand, they're dangerous beasts. On the other hand, they take care of us and our children. On the other hand, they have no intellect and creativity. On the other hand, we depend upon them, right, for our entire economy. Our entire economy and livelihood depends upon people we've just said are inferior. And as I would say to my college students, don't ever look for logic in racism, because it is not logical. Beginning with the point of human beings aren't quite human. Once you make that statement, nothing else can follow it but lies, right? Barbara?
Hi, Lily. Thank you so much. I learned so much today. I've been teaching for over 50 years. Mm-hmm. So much of what you said today, it's certainly not in our history books by any means. I have 2 Black grandsons. I want you to come back. Please come back and give us more information and give us time to ask some of these basic questions. What do I say to my friends who say, oh, I'm not racist? What do I tell my grandsons who are now teenagers? What if you're stopped? What if this? What if that? So could you come back?
Sure.
Oh,
I think I will be hanging out with all of you for a while now, would be my guess. But these are really important questions. I mean, I've had, America can't and doesn't talk about slavery. And it is so different, as I've said to people on social media, so different from Germany and the Holocaust, so different from South Africa and apartheid, where learning about the nation's atrocities is required and assumed. It does not get rid of the kind of core of anti-Semitism in Germany or anti-Blackness in South Africa. It does not get rid of it by any means. But it is impossible to address a national, not Southern, but national wrong when somehow I'm getting something that my session is ended.
Oh, we're still here.
We hear you.
And that I need to sign in again.
Oh, no, I think you're good.
Okay, I'm ignoring it.
An hour.
Yeah.
Good.
Not ignore.
Yeah, I don't know Zoom that well either. Where was I?
About a national.
Right. I think that what has happened, though, in Germany and in South Africa is that you can move toward making a difference only after you have affirmed the history, no matter how ugly it is. And in fact, maybe the uglier it is, the more important it is to end that, to end the silence.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Hi. So in your opinion, do you think the Civil War was about, from LinkedIn, from the North perspective, was about ending slavery or about keeping the Union together? And to what extent would they have tolerated slavery if they could have just kept the Union together?
Yeah. Great question. I love talking about the North. Talking about the South somehow becomes easy, but one of the things I preach, maybe too much, but I'll do it anyway, is that the more the nation can say, and it becomes part of this lie and this subterfuge, the more the nation can say that racism, segregation, discrimination, the more it can frame it as being Southern, the more the nation can kind of Pontius Pilate, like wipe his hands, wash his hands and say, we are the North and it's those people. And then can also say it's not a national issue, it's that region. And number one, what that does, it erases the whole colonial history where all 13 colonies had slaves. Slavery was written into the laws of Massachusetts. And so you would end up erasing the origins of American history if, in fact, you made racial discrimination, violence, slavery Southern. But that has been a national trope, right? The effort to do that. Even when people think civil rights movement, they don't think Boston. They think Jackson, Mississippi. And they really should think Boston and Chicago and New York and New Jersey. And New Jersey. I think that, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your question.
Just to the extent to which this was a war, war about the end of slavery versus an economic war about keeping the Union together.
Right. So it was very, very clear to Lincoln in particular, and it was clear when he's calling up for troops, that white Northerners were not going to fight for the end of slavery. That was, when we think about abolition, it was, as is often the case, Black people in the North and a handful of white radicals who are considered to be fringe element, marginal, and dangerous, and run out of town and tarred and feathered, and tomatoes and vegetables thrown at them at abolitionist rallies. And so which also shifts the whole idea of the North fighting for freedom. No, it's a handful of radical people, John Brown, Harper's Ferry, willing to die to end slavery. That is always, a handful of people willing to do that. Most are not. The North doesn't want, the North is, Northerners express their fear about the abolition of slavery. They are afraid those Black people will come here. The North already has this fulsome development of segregation laws and laws against housing and all of that, those constructions there. So there is no embracing of the abolition of slavery in the North whatsoever. But you're correct. The economic issues are serious in terms of the growing industrial economy of the North. There's also a serious element of the authority of the federal government in terms of national expansion in territories, and that brings up who decides how those territories will be brought into statehood, who has authority. And slavery becomes part of that debate, but not so much in terms of ending slavery in the South at all. It really is more the expansion of it. In fact, Southerners are talking about how they need to expand slavery into Mexico and Central America and South America also, that they need more slavery. So I think that Lincoln had problems actually recruiting troops, as you know, in the North. And that was one of the reasons they did not want to fight for the end of slavery. So in part, I think what incentivizes the North to some degree will be the South's intransigence. Its attacks, as Fort Sumter illustrates, on national sovereignty and on the North. That in itself becomes an incentive, and in some ways the abolition of slavery is a disincentive for most Northerners to fight. Leo, was your hand up earlier?
It was up earlier. I just wanted to thank you for such a thorough conversation from a historical perspective. I've attended many Juneteenth programs, but nothing that's ever given the kind of depth you provided here, and also brought it back to today, because I think it gives the context that something that happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 200 years ago is still very much a part of today's reality, because it becomes indoctrinated into a system. And I think a lot of us miss that when we think it's a few bad apples acting out or doing something, or it's a vigilante. And all of these things are allowed to perpetuate because they can't exist in a system that perpetuates it, whether people can visually recognize it or not. And I think you provided some good context to help. So just want to thank you for such thorough information. I learned a lot that I did not know, especially about things that were happening, some freedoms that were enacted and how long it took freedoms to be enacted prior to the Civil War. It just shows it's a very long history of fighting and standing for one's humanhood.
Yes, yes. And it also demonstrates that African-American freedom only came with a fight. That there is no instance in our history as a nation or in the colonies when it was simply institutionally or it was given as an institution or by a political entity simply declaring freedom. That it took, even with the revolution, it took petitions that sometimes weren't even accepted because Black people can't bring petitions. I also, one of the excuse me, really interesting comments you just made, though, is the way people will distance themselves from some history. So the history of enslavement of Black people will be hundreds of years ago. I wasn't part of that. But how would you rationalize saying the Constitution was written hundreds of years ago? I'm not part of that. The Declaration was written hundreds of years ago. I'm not part of that. The Civil War was fought hundreds of years ago. I'm not, I mean, how do you dismantle which parts of history you inherit and then some parts of history you haven't? Again, racism is always irrational. We inherit all of it. I mean, all of us inherit all of it, right? And so what always inspires me is the way in which my college students understand that and embrace that. And when I hear from them now, that they are, in their 20s, 30s, I have students in their 40s, they get it. And so when they are going out into the world, especially as white students, they can answer those questions, right? They can answer the questions and they feel equipped to do so. And they do so so powerfully. I share lots of the things they have to say. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Let me ask all of you. Barbara, I think you mentioned wanting to come back and talk about, in some ways, how to create the conversation. Right?
Yes.
How to create the conversation. Are there other kinds of, not just questions, but things that you think sessions like this could provide, and that topics that need to be covered, kind of not only the history, but maybe some way to create more of a workshop format of a to-do kind of action items. I never like to separate the two. I always like to begin with the history, because that's what I do, and then move from the history to, and now what are my responsibilities in 2020, given that I have inherited every moment of that history. I've inherited Black people's struggles. I have inherited the systemic racism and violence against Black people. I have inherited the bravery of a handful of radical fringe allies who put their lives on the line on freedom rides into the South, right? I have inherited all of that. I've inherited the Declaration. I've inherited the Constitution. What do I do with all of this in my own life? And I do think it's, in some ways, it's highly individualized. At the same time, many of us are part of a variety of organizations, whether it's houses of faith, whether it's neighborhood organizations, whether it's being a good citizen in your community in terms of knowing how are the children in this community being educated. We all have a responsibility there in terms of the next generation. How are teachers even being trained, right? Are teachers trained to teach it? So it isn't just content, it has to also deal with pedagogy of the delivery of the information by a K through 12 teacher. How are parents, Black and white parents, empowered to know, how do I talk to my children, my grandchildren, my nieces, my nephews, to message the validity of all of humanity, and always, always their own humanity, right? I used to say to my children as they, well, at least in my mind, as my children were growing up, I thought, I want them to embrace themselves as Black people and all that that means, from their family heritage to their national heritage to their international and global heritage. I want them to understand they do so without impugning or diminishing anybody else's. That their statue in the sight of God depends upon diminishing no one. And in fact, it is helpful to their humanity to elevate everyone. And so as people will say to me very often, kind of like, wow, how did your son become active now in high school? And I'll say, because I raised him to be a feminist. It was intentional. I taught it because it will not happen accidentally. I assume that society is feeding our kids societal messages all the time. So I assumed I was going to be the general in that battle and provide my children and their friends and my students, my college students, with an alternative view, and hope that it would stick. But it had to be intentional. But I'm sure parents feel, a bit overwhelmed by and grandparents and aunts and uncles, what to do in terms of children. How much of ugliness do you present to them, right? My answer to that is Disney does it all the time. Star Wars does it all the time. Kind of, how evil can you be? Kids get it in fantasy all the time. We just don't give it to them in terms of reality. I think they understand evil very much.
So hopefully you will continue to have this conversation with us over time. I think a workshop, I don't know how the other participants feel, but I think a workshop where we can interact with you and ask questions and give you scenarios. And this way, hopefully, we can do the right thing for our children, our students in the future.
Right. What I would love to do for that, again, I always defer to experts. I'd love to have somebody on who was in child development or even child psychology, right? And I know some Black psychologists who actually work with children. I know some who've studied Black psychology, that there is a cultural and historical context to understanding how we engage the world. There is no kind of purist scientific way, because usually that ends up being the majority way. It doesn't apply to everybody. So I like combining the historical context with people who have these specific areas of expertise and that I do not have. So I can talk about how I apply the expertise I learn from other people, but I do not purport to be the expert on child development, although my children think I am. Don't tell them I said I wasn't. Okay, then thank you all so very much for having me back. I hope I brought some clarity to the issue in spite of getting off of a plane at midnight last night and wearing a mask for about 5 hours straight.
Dr. Edwards, it's Sandra. I just wanted to say, truly, just like everyone else, I really appreciate what you've done. You really struck a chord with me when you said so poignantly about you were intentional and talking to your children and raising them in the way in which you did. I almost feel like that's the work that a lot of people need, because you have to be intentional about what you're doing if you're going to dismantle bad things, as you put it, racism, but also to bring up strong people who can survive, particularly Black children who can survive the evils of this society the way they are. And I almost would just love to hear that conversation that you had with your children, because it gives us words that maybe some of us don't have. So that might be something you'll consider.
That's a really interesting idea. If I had you actually talk to my children. My son has ended up with actually has a Ph.D. in American Studies and also with a concentration in women's and gender studies. And he does critical race theory. He has, when he was living in New York, he joined up with a feminist reading group. So if nothing else, I will also say, whenever I mention to people that he was a member of NOW at Montclair High School, the first thing people say is, your high school had a chapter of NOW? So I am also very grateful for this particular community and the communal raising of my children. It was indeed a unique and distinctive experience in terms of the entire community and school and teachers and their peers. I think they would in fact say the same, that they actually do give this community itself a great deal of credit for shaping their ideology and the way they deal with the world. In fact, it would be interesting. I can think of not just my children, but even I could pull together a small group, there maybe 5 at most, of some of my Drew students, all from New Jersey, right, who went to New Jersey public schools, who would contextualize in some ways this particular New Jersey experience, and include that K through 12 piece, what did and didn't happen. And then the way they are now engaging the world. I really do value the idea of listening to Gen Z and millennials who have a completely different view of the world, of themselves and of other people. And they probably have a lot more to teach you than I do. And so that would be another interesting kind of intergenerational conversation, right?
Yes, I agree.
And I would be one of the participants with you, listening and learning. But I can think of some of my former Black and white Drew students who have powerful stories about their own convictions and commitments to a more just society. And they live it, they live that commitment. It isn't even a movement for them. It is them. It is who they are in everything they do in their lives. And they have testimonies, right? They become evidence to me also of what is possible in carrying a torch of social justice and being convicted in making a difference in people's lives. So, Katie, Michelle, I've given us another session to create.
Sounds like 10 more workshops or Zoom meetings.
Yeah, I'll be emailing you, Lillie. Don't worry. I'll be following up by email.
Okay, Katie, we're depending on you.
Yes. And thank you all again so very much. This means a great deal to me. This is my, as my husband says, you seem to be working a whole lot for somebody retired. But it is indeed a labor of love, and I find it inspiring to also hear from all of you. So I wanted you to know how much you all mean in the kind of work that I'm doing in terms of public history and trying to use the history itself as an inspiration. So I think this is a mutual experience of inspiration and uplifting for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank